presentation.
All right, can everyone hear me and see my presentation?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, so my name is Alexis Wilkman. Thank you guys who have made it to the end of the day here. We're gonna power through. But today I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about some of the projects that I've been working on over the course of my service year with Sequoia Riverlands Trust, and these are related to rangeland monitoring and regenerative grazing. So Sequoia Riverlands Trust, or SRT, is based in Visalia, which, for those of you who don't know, is just south of Fresno in Tulare County. And Tulare County is the ancestral home of the Yokuts as well as the Western Mono people. And it's also the site of what was once the Great Tulare Lake, which at its time was the largest body of water west of the Mississippi. And the presence of this lake, or the historic presence of this lake, is probably the reason that Tulare County has some of the most productive and valuable farmland in the entire world. Frankly, the impact of really intense agriculture can be seen everywhere in this community. As soon as you leave Visalia proper, it's like pistachios and almond orchards as far as the eye can see, huge orchards of mandarins and other types of citrus, as well as massive cornfields that are supporting these super large dairies. You know, while the impact of agriculture is really intense, there is not a lot of open space or green space access for members of the public here in Tulare County. What hasn't been developed is a small amount of rangeland, primarily blue oak, savanna, and woodlands. There's also a patchwork of some really interesting habitat types such as sycamore alluvial woodlands, alkali meadows, riparian forests, and vernal pools. So SRT, as really the only land trust that is operating in this part of the valley, SRT is really uniquely positioned to conserve these threatened landscapes. And as the only GrizzlyCorps member who is placed with a land trust, I thought I would talk really quickly about what land trusts do. So land trusts own and manage land. In the case of SRT, this is to reach conservation goals. And SRT does this through a few different means. First, SRT owns 7 preserves outright, and most of these are accessible to the public. They also hold conservation easements, which are agreements with private landowners to conserve their property or a part of their property in perpetuity. They also have mitigation contracts. So following some sort of large development like a solar development or the high-speed rail development that's happening here in the valley, they will manage or restore land to mitigate for that damage. SRT also has a thriving volunteer and events program. It seems like there are events happening basically every weekend. I've taken part in many different plantings and trail building, as well as some fun, like family-friendly seasonal events as well. Last but not least, SRT has a large and growing education program. They are bringing students from across Tulare County out to their preserves for general field trips and citizen science projects, as well as for their Earth Academy education program, which I'll talk about shortly. But SRT's impact is really not limited to just Tulare County. They're operating all the way out into eastern San Luis Obispo County in the Carrizo Plains, as well as just north of LA and in the southern Sierra Nevada. So when I first arrived at SRT, Ben, my supervisor, the director of mitigation and land management, identified with me a couple main goals for my service year. Of course, I've been very fortunate that I've worked on many different projects while I've been here, and these projects have all evolved with the challenges posed by COVID. But these were some of the main things that we wanted to prioritize. First, that I develop and implement a vegetation monitoring project at SRT Preserves, and we ended up focusing this at Blue Oak Ranch Preserve, as well as did some monitoring at other preserves and some of our easements. I collaborated with the SRT education team to sort of translate this rangeland monitoring technique into lessons for the Earth Academy education program. And finally, I reached out to some of SRT's grazing lessees to start a conversation about regenerative grazing and soil health. I'll start by talking about the main monitoring project, which took place at Blue Oak Ranch. And Blue Oak Ranch Preserve, predictably, is a blue oak savanna and woodland that is situated in the southern Sierras, just north of Springville, California, if you happen to know where that is. And like almost all of SRT's preserves, it's grazed by cattle. So the goal of this monitoring project was to get a baseline understanding of the vegetation across the preserve, the land cover more generally, as well as identify where perennial grasses and other perennials exist on the preserve. SRT has a broad goal of reperennializing the landscape at this preserve and other SRT preserves. And also evaluating the height class across the preserve to be sure that it is sustainable as far as grazing management. And I focused on 3 distinct regions of the preserve: this Denison Creek region in the western part of the preserve, which is a pasture located in a floodplain of Denison Creek; the central region of the preserve, which is where the cattle are spending the vast majority of their time; and this region that we refer to as the Panhandle, which is slightly higher elevation, has a slightly different soils and different plant species composition. And there also aren't any water resources in this part of the preserve, so the cattle don't make it out there as often as we would hope they would. So the application that we used was called Land Potential Knowledge Systems, and this was developed at the Jornada Rangeland Research Station in New Mexico with collaboration from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and USAID, which is the government agency responsible for development, among other agencies and organizations. And really, the app was developed as a poverty reduction tool. It's a free application that is designed to be used anywhere in the world. It has many different modules within the application. Obviously, the vegetation module is the one we were most interested in, although it also has a soils module that is connected to data from the NRCS. There is a farm management module and a habitat module that was added recently. So we were focused on using the vegetation module, which has a built-in monitoring protocol that we call the stick method. We call it that because it's named after herders in Africa who walk their lands with only a stick. And the idea is that you really only need a stick to complete this monitoring. And it's quick and simple. You don't need a background in biology or botany to do it. And one of the really nice things about this application is that it instantly creates reports for you after you've completed data collection, which is really helpful from an educational standpoint, using it as an educational tool, as well as just helping us gauge where we're at kind of when we're in the field. And this app is constantly being updated and changed, but we did this in the fall at Blue Oak, and it worked really well for us. I'll just say, for the sake of time, quickly, that we did see subtle differences across the preserve in different land cover types, especially herbaceous litter, and some differences in the different proportions of height classes across the preserve. And this is almost certainly due to these differences that I mentioned in the grazing regime. Like I mentioned, the cattle are not really getting out to the Panhandle as often as we would hope. There are also differences in soils, and the perennials we were finding mostly in the Denison Creek area, as this is a floodplain and it's a little wetter over there. So we established this baseline and we learned the ins and outs of this application. And now the idea is that my replacement fellow Emily, as well as other staff at SRT, will continue on with this monitoring so we can assess changes that may be happening over time in response to environmental stressors such as drought or our land management technique, which in this case would be the grazing. And we've been really fortunate that we've had the opportunity to train some of our easement holders and other staff on using this application. And we have sort of gathered a list of feedback that we have for the folks at Land PKS that we have shared with them. In the winter and the spring, I was privileged to work with SRT's education team in the Earth Academy education program. This is an 8-module education program, very similar to an internship. High school students in Tulare County apply and interview and then take part in these field days where we collect data, they discuss different topics in environmental science and also explore careers in the environmental field. And as an educator, this was a really refreshing experience because all of the students that were there wanted to be there. During these 2 modules that I worked on, the soils, grazing, and rangeland management module, as well as the changing ecosystems module, we touched on themes such as soil health and carbon, climate change, and how humans are impacting the landscape, as well as being impacted by the landscape. And by the end of these lessons, where we were using Land PKS as a way to teach these concepts, they were doing the monitoring entirely on their own. They were identifying patterns on the landscape and they were asking really fantastic questions. So it was a huge success for us. We also used the app's soil testing features to play around with soil texture and color and compare that to data from the NRCS with the students. And since these lessons, I've developed curricula related to the modules that will hopefully this week, I believe, be shared on the Land PKS website Knowledge Hub. And they also featured us on their blog earlier this year, which was fantastic. Just being able to connect with the folks at Land PKS and develop this rapport with them was one of the most rewarding aspects of this entire project. We have been able to share our feedback as staff members using the application, as well as feedback that we've gotten from our students. And they've been very gracious about accepting that feedback, as well as sharing their online platform with SRT. One of the things that we accomplished incidentally during this Earth Academy experience was monitoring the state-threatened striped adobe lily at our Lewis Hill Preserve. This is a very rare and it's an important plant for folks at SRT, and figuring out where these lilies are at the preserve and mapping their extent was something that our land steward had really wanted to accomplish for some time. And I was really proud that I was able to map the extent of these lilies at the preserve. And with the help of our Earth Academy students, we monitored them and were able to estimate the density of these lilies. This was a huge win for SRT. Finally, and most recently, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 4 of 6 grazing lessees at SRT. So I didn't get to talk to everyone, but this was expected and it was still very rewarding and definitely a highlight of my service year. And the goal of these interviews was to get an idea of our grazers' sort of land management philosophy, the indicators that they're looking for as they're moving their cattle, and also assess what they know about regenerative grazing, if anything, and also hear from their perspective what the barriers and motivations might be to adopting more regenerative grazing practices. These conversations were really eye-opening, so many great insights. I'll just say briefly that these 4 ranchers come from, I would say, pretty different backgrounds, but I was hearing the same themes over and over, including that the economics of small-time grazing doesn't favor the ranchers. They are often struggling to break even, especially in a year like this, where the growing season for grass was extraordinarily short, and we just didn't get any rain. But these folks are not in the cattle business for the money. They're in it because they're really passionate about it. They enjoy spending time outside, riding their horses around, and the general cowboy lifestyle. Another interesting insight from these conversations was that there's not a lot of enthusiasm for the concept of climate change. And I didn't even use the words climate change during these interviews, but I think everyone picked up on what I was getting at with my questions about the drought and how it had been affecting their operation. It's clear that from their perspective, they don't really subscribe to the doom and gloom that I probably do, and they're generally proponents of this idea that the rain in California is very cyclical and that it's coming back around really soon. And I don't have the ability to predict the future, so I don't know that that's true, but it was very interesting to hear. And all of our ranchers were familiar with either regenerative grazing as a concept, or with these two particular tools in the regenerative grazing toolbox, the first being rotational grazing and the second being flash grazing or high intensity short duration grazing. And predictably, there was a concern that if you ask them to change their land management practices, you're asking them to invest more in ranch infrastructure, such as fencing or water troughs, as well as invest more time and labor. And it's also very difficult to do this on dry land in a dry year. They did identify that increasing the stocking rate of cattle and or having more forage for their cattle on the land would be a huge benefit for them. And the intrinsic value of the habitat and the landscape did also come up, which was very refreshing to hear. We also, towards the end of our conversations, briefly discussed the potential for a more widespread carbon market or a payment for ecosystem services type of scheme. And obviously the idea that they could get paid to change their land management practices would be a huge benefit to them as well. I had the privilege of working on so many different fun and interesting projects at SRT. I learned how to do all sorts of different types of monitoring, and I started doing research on some upcoming really interesting projects at SRT, such as some beaver dam analogs and a rangeland compost application project. But one of the big highlights for me was spending time out in the Carrizo Plains, which is the largest intact grassland in California. And I didn't even know that this place existed before I started my service year. I've spent a lot of time out there doing things like residual dry matter monitoring, kangaroo rat trapping, and rare plant monitoring, among other tasks. It's a very beautiful place. I recommend you Google it. Maybe if we get some good rain this year, there will be a super bloom. So there were many great learning opportunities while I've been at SRT, and I was very fortunate that I had the ability to hop around and try everything that I could try while I was here. As a reflection, I took a year off from graduate school to come and do this year of service, and I was a little apprehensive about doing a year of service during a pandemic. I also came here with some preconceived notions about what the Valley is like and what it would be like to live in the Valley. I'm happy to say I was wrong about many of those things. And despite, some of the logistical challenges posed by COVID, especially when it comes to the education projects and the rancher outreach, which I had to postpone until very recently, we accomplished everything that we set out to accomplish and then some. And that was with the help of Ben, who is just a wealth of knowledge about rangeland and the West in general, as well as all of the staff at SRT who are so flexible and were very generous with their time and sharing their knowledge with me. Another highlight was spending this past year with 3 other AmeriCorps members that are based here at SRT. They're with the Sierra Nevada AmeriCorps Partnership, and I had so much fun working with them in the field, and I'm very lucky to count them among my friends. We accidentally accomplished some things this year that were super important, like establishing the rapport with the folks at Land PKS. And I learned many new skills. Just a couple right off the top of my head, I taught myself how to use QGIS. And one highlight was a day at one of our conservation easements where I learned how to use a skid steer, which is not something that I ever thought I would do in my life. I also learned a lot about the Central Valley and about myself while I've been here. And I'm really thankful to Ben, all of the staff at SRT, and the folks at GrizzlyCorps for giving me the opportunity to do this year of service. And if we have time, I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
We definitely have time, so feel free to put it in the chat, the Q&A, or to raise your hand if you'd like to speak. I have a question for you, Alexis. So since you'll be returning to complete out your master's degree, how has this service year impacted you as you're in the middle of your second degree?
I've learned a lot about some policy topics in California and some more general environmental topics in California that I would really like to pursue when I go back to graduate school. Maybe this comes as a surprise to some of the folks that are still here listening, but the Beaver Dam analogs in particular was really interesting to me, and I'm hoping that I can learn a little bit more about that in the coming year and see how this could be a potential policy solution. The hydrology of the valley was something that was particularly interesting to me, and I found BDAs to be a really interesting solution.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question that's come in. What was your greatest challenge working with the ranchers, and how did you overcome that?
As I said, I wasn't able to really work with all of these ranchers until recently, but I think that the main challenge was that there are some ideological differences between myself and these ranchers. But frankly, it wasn't that much of a challenge, I don't think. I was very careful about the way that I was communicating with these folks. And frankly, what I learned just doing these interviews is that there's a lot of common ground between myself as a quote unquote tree hugger and some of these ranchers. We are working generally towards the same goals. We care about the land and we care about habitat values, and we want to protect rangeland in California for future generations. So just finding that common ground made things so much easier.
Thank you. Great. Any other questions? Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for staying with us through the second day. And thank you again, Alexis. So we'll share